They weren't slave traders. They didn't own the ships or the chains. They wore suits, not blood, yet they were the ones who made slavery unstoppable. In candle-lit offices and marble courtrooms, they sat behind desks, drafting the language of human bondage, transforming flesh into law, and suffering into profit. Their weapons weren't whips or guns. They were words, clauses, contracts, signatures. Every scream, every sale, every lash, and all perfectly legal because they said so. They called it property rights. They called it freedom. But what they really built was a legal fortress around evil itself. These were the men who gave slavery its power. The ones who proved that injustice doesn't always wear chains. Sometimes it wears a lawyer's robe. This is their story. The forgotten architects of slavery's wealth. The slavery lawyers. Long before the great plantations rose, before America called itself a nation, there were documents, charters, codes, and clauses written in careful, deliberate ink. In the 1600s, the earliest English colonies faced a question no one had ever answered in law. How do you own a human being? In 1661, the colony of Barbados gave the world its answer, the Barbados Slave Code. It declared that Africans were not people, but chattel, property to be owned, sold, and punished. That single document became the model for the American colonies that followed. Lawyers and legislators adopted its principles, drafting laws that allowed a person to be listed next to cattle or furniture on wills and deeds. In Virginia, a child's fate was written before birth. The child shall follow the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, so was the child, forever. This single line, written by colonial lawyers, ensured that slavery would reproduce itself endlessly. And all of it perfectly legal. They didn't hold the whips. They didn't stand in the fields or auction off bodies beneath the sun. But they did something far more powerful. They made it legal. The men in black robes and powdered wigs, the lawyers, the judges, the architects of human bondage. While the world remembers the slave masters and traders, the whips and the chains, it forgets the minds that built the system itself. Every lash of the whip was backed by a signature. Every sale was sealed with a lawyer's pen. And every scream was echoed in the silence of a courtroom. This is the story of the slavery lawyers, the men who used the law not to deliver justice but to defend injustice. But it wasn't just the lawyers in their offices. It was also the judges, the men who sat in silence and wrote the final word of the law. In 1857, one of those judges made history for all the wrong reasons. Dred Scott, a man born into slavery, sued for his freedom after being taken into free territory. He believed justice would recognize his humanity. But when his case reached the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered a verdict that would shake the nation. African Americans, he wrote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. With that single sentence, centuries of moral struggle collapsed. Freedom was denied by the highest law in the land. The law, it seemed, was not blind, it was bought. Inside quiet law offices, slavery was not seen as horror but as business. Imagine a lawyer's chamber in 1790. Feather quills, ink pots, thick books of statute. A man enters not to buy land or a house but to buy another human being. The lawyer records the name, the age, the price, and the terms of sale. He stamps it, files it, and sends it to the courthouse. A slave deed. In the eyes of the law, there was no difference between selling a man and selling a mule. Behind every line of that paperwork was a broken life. A woman separated from her child, a man priced at $200, a family erased by a signature. Lawyers became the invisible machinery of the slave economy. They wrote the mortgages on human beings, the insurance policies on slave ships, and the wills that divided families as inheritance. When a slave owner died, lawyers were summoned not to free the enslaved, but to appraise them, to decide which heir would get which worker, and whose labor was worth more. The law gave every horror a number, every life a value, every scream a price tag. To hold such a monstrous system together required precision, and that precision came through law, through what were called the slave codes. These codes defined not only what slaves could do, but what they could never do. A slave could not own property, could not testify in court, could not learn to read, could not strike a white person even in self-defense. Every moment of existence was regulated by statute, and when enslaved people escaped, Lawyers drafted new laws, the Fugitive Slave Acts, forcing even free states to return them to their masters. The entire nation became a hunting ground, built on the paperwork of men who believed they were serving justice. Most people imagine slavery as a southern sin, a world of cotton, whips, and plantations. But the truth is far darker and far wider. Northern lawyers, bankers, and institutions were the silent partners of the slave economy. Wall Street firms, some that still exist today, made their first fortunes writing slave bonds and handling insurance claims on enslaved lives. They represented shipping companies and plantation owners, making sure every ship and every body on it was accounted for. If a slave died on a voyage, the insurance payout went not to the family but to the owner. Human life reduced to paperwork and profit. Even the great universities, Harvard, Yale, Brown, and Columbia, grew rich from the donations of slave traders and the legal men who represented them. The North wrote the rules. The South enforced them. Together they made slavery unbreakable. When emancipation finally arrived in 1865, the old lawyers didn't vanish. They adapted. They wrote new rules called the Black Codes, laws designed to keep newly freed people trapped in poverty. A freed man who couldn't find work could be arrested for vagrancy. A woman walking alone could be charged with disorderly conduct. Once arrested, they were fined, and if they couldn't pay, they were leased out to factories, mines, and railroads. Once again, the same families, the same businesses, the same lawyers profited from their labor. The whips were gone, but the signatures remained. The plantations crumbled, but the law still stood. Behind every clause, every statute, every elegant word was the same cold purpose: to turn humanity into profit. The brilliance of the slavery lawyers wasn't in their cruelty. It was in their precision. They discovered that you don't need chains if your laws are strong enough. Contracts replaced cages, clauses replaced lashes. Freedom became a matter of paperwork, impossible to obtain without a lawyer's consent and a white man's approval. Even after slavery was abolished, many of those same lawyers simply changed the vocabulary. They replaced the word slave with convict, the plantation with the prison. They called it leasing or debt labor, and the system continued. The law remained the weapon, sharper than any blade. The Southern courts had become sanctuaries of slaveholders' rights. Every time an enslaved man ran for freedom, his fate rested not on morality but on property law. A human being could stand before a judge, breathe, speak, weep, and yet in the eyes of the law he was no different from a plow or a cow. That was the system lawyers built and swore to defend. Behind their polished desks, these men turned humanity into clauses and cash. They drafted ironclad contracts ensuring slaves would pass down as inheritance, generation after generation. Even in death, a slaveholder could ensure that his property remained profitable. Lawyers found ways to calculate not only a slave's labor value, but their reproductive potential. A young enslaved woman wasn't seen as a life, but as future wealth, a vessel of renewable property. Every child she bore was automatically written into the master's estate. The legal paper trail of slavery ran deeper than any chain. It bound generations before they were even born. The story of the slavery lawyers is not just about the past. It's about the creation of a system that never truly ended. The names changed, the language evolved, but the machinery of control stayed in motion. It is the reminder that injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it writes. The story of slavery is often told in chains, in blood, and in human suffering, but behind those walls of torment stood another fortress, a quieter, colder one, built not of iron or stone, but of words, documents, and signatures. In the mid-1800s, America's legal elite weren't just lawyers. They were engineers of oppression. They didn't own whips or fields, but their pens carried more power than any overseer's lash. One of the darkest examples came with the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. Dred Scott, a man born into slavery, sued for his freedom after being taken into free territory. But the lawyers defending the slaveholder had something else in mind. They wanted to create a legal precedent that would protect slavery everywhere. And they did. The Supreme Court ruled that African Americans could never be citizens, and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. Behind the scenes, lawyers and judges had turned the highest court in the land into a weapon of enslavement. In states like Virginia, Georgia, and Louisiana, slave codes expanded under the careful watch of attorneys who called themselves defenders of Southern liberty. But their version of liberty only extended to the men who could afford it. They argued that government interference in slavery was an attack on personal property, twisting the founding principles of freedom into shields for tyranny. The very Constitution that promised liberty was used to protect bondage. The lawyers didn't just defend slavery, they legitimized it. They gave it the illusion of morality through legality. Every whip, every auction, every child torn from their mother was backed by a contract. When abolitionists rose up and began challenging slavery, the defenders of the system didn't just fight with guns, they fought with court filings and lawsuits. They flooded newspapers with arguments about states' rights, private ownership, and constitutional freedom, all while ignoring the screams that echoed from the plantations. The true horror wasn't just what these lawyers did, it was how rational they made it all sound. They wore tailored suits, spoke in measured tones, and debated the value of human souls in marble courtrooms. Their voices were calm, their reasoning airtight, their cruelty disguised as civility. In their eyes, the enslaved were never victims, just assets. And as long as the paperwork was in order, no crime was committed. Even Northern lawyers weren't innocent. Many of them invested in Southern plantations or represented clients whose wealth came from slave-backed loans. Their law firms, some of which still exist today, handled insurance policies for slave ships, mortgages for slave buyers, and disputes over lost cargo when enslaved Africans died during transit. The ledgers of those firms were drenched in invisible blood, and yet in modern boardrooms their names are remembered as symbols of prestige. As the Civil War approached, many of these legal architects turned into defenders of the Confederacy. Some helped draft the Confederate Constitution, which explicitly protected slavery forever. They were proud of their work, believing that the old order would never die. But history had other plans. When the war ended, and the South lay in ruins, many of these men quietly burned their records, hiding the evidence of their complicity. Yet, not everything disappeared. Fragments survived: letters, legal papers, transactions. They tell the story of how lawyers turned cruelty into business. The legacy of those contracts didn't die with emancipation. After the war, the same minds who wrote slave laws helped craft new systems: black codes, convict leasing, and segregated labor laws. The ink that once chained slaves was now used to control freedmen. The system evolved, not vanished. But history has a way of turning ink into ghosts. Today, historians digging through archives have uncovered the letters, receipts, and legal drafts that built the economic foundation of slavery. Each document whispers the same truth. The system survived not only because of violence, but because of paperwork. The lawyers of slavery didn't just protect wealth, they created it. They gave slavery permanence, structure, and respectability. Without them, the system would have collapsed under its own brutality. But with them, it became a machine, efficient, lawful, unstoppable. The story of the slavery lawyers isn't about evil men in shadows. It's about how ordinary intelligence, education, and ambition can be used to defend the indefensible. It's about how law, the very thing meant to protect justice, can become the perfect disguise for injustice. When you stand in front of the courthouses that still bear their names or walk past law firms that once insured the slave trade, you're walking through the afterlife of their work. The architecture remains. Only the victims have vanished, but the truth never dies. It lingers in the archives, in the margins of old contracts, in the legal codes that shaped a nation. These were the lawyers who protected slave wealth, and in doing so, they rewrote the moral code of America itself. The ghost of those lawyers still lingers in the foundation of American law. Corporate charters, property rights, and even modern financial structures trace back to the same logic: that wealth can be protected even when humanity cannot. The legal DNA of slavery still pulses beneath modern institutions, and so, when we talk about the brutality of slavery, we must also talk about the brilliance, dark, strategic, deliberate, of the men who made it legal. They didn't swing the whip, but they made sure the whip was never questioned. They didn't trade in flesh, but they wrote the rules that kept the flesh in chains. They made the inhuman seem inevitable.